Please excuse the interruption while I share some important information about the Sunday Morning Coffee Podcast. If you would like to support the show, and believe me, I appreciate you supporting the show just by watching, there are a couple of ways that you can help out. You can visit our Patreon page at patreon.com/smcpod. That's patreon.com/smcpod, where for just $4 a month, you can receive early access to episodes and subscriber-only content. If you prefer to make a one-time donation instead of a monthly donation, you can head over to buymeacoffee.com/smcpod. I'm not going to spell that one out, but it's spelled exactly as it sounds. buymeacoffee.com/smcpod, where you can make a one-time donation in any amount. Your support does not go unnoticed. Thank you for watching, thank you for your support, and I hope you enjoy the rest of today's episode. I'm very, very happy to welcome Linnea Butler to the Sunday Morning Coffee Podcast. Linnea, thank you for your time, and I've been looking forward to this conversation.
Well, thank you very much for having me, Scott.
So the way I usually start off is I ask my guests to just give my audience a little bit of a background about yourself, who you are, and how you ended up on the path that you're on today.
Certainly. I am a licensed marriage and family therapist in California, and I am an owner and founder of a group practice called Bay Area Mental Health. I sort of came here in a rather circuitous route. I started out, my first career was as a research scientist, and then I went into marketing. Very long story short, I ended up as a therapist and feel like this has always been my true calling. And the topic that I think we are focusing on today is psychedelic psychotherapy, which is something that I've become very passionate about over the last 5 or 6 years.
And what was your introduction to the topic of psychedelic psychotherapy? Try to say that 3 or 4 times quickly. So how did you end up, where did your interest in that come from? And where has it led you in your own career?
Great question. Unlike a lot of folks that come to psychedelics through their own experience, I was sort of that really straight-laced, buttoned-up kid. First time I smoked marijuana was in college, so it was not something I experimented with. But again, I came to this through a very circuitous route. When I was in research, I was focused on genetics, and even though I left that field quite a long time ago, I've been following what happens with regard to genetics and psychology. And so I was really tracking what was happening with the MDMA clinical trials. That was of a lot of interest to me. And as the results were starting to come in and it was getting closer, I reached out to somebody who was a private investigator on the clinical trial and said, hey, what do I do to start to prepare myself for when this comes out? And she said, well, you know, there's the MAPS training, which I have since completed. But she also said, you know, you can work with ketamine. And my initial response to that was, not interested. That's a medical procedure. It's IVs in emergency rooms for highly suicidal patients. It's not really what I do. And she said, oh no, there's a new paradigm for ketamine where we are combining ketamine as a dissociative anesthetic along with concurrent psychotherapy. I thought, oh, that sounds interesting. I'll give it a whirl. I'll join for, the first day of the training. And I was hooked immediately. It felt like coming home. And that sort of ushered in my personal work and also my professional work. And it's become the area that I focus on most professionally now.
So just going back for a second, you mentioned the term MAPS, which I'm assuming is an acronym for something. Could you just share what MAPS is and what it entails?
Sure. Sorry about that.
Oh, it's quite all right.
MAPS is the Multidisciplinary Association for Psychedelic Studies. And it was founded by Rick Doblin in, I believe it was 1986, right after psychedelics became illegal. It's a nonprofit organization dedicated to studying the various different kinds of psychedelics and how they can be used intentionally and with a sacredness to it to actually heal. So it's very different than somebody just having a trip and having a good time. When you place it in the context of a healing modality where you're focused on set and setting. And we can talk about set and setting later if you like. But essentially, set is your mindset, what you're going into this with, and setting is what is the environment. With psychedelic psychotherapy, setting is in a clinician's office. Usually, it's not at a rave or something like that. And the mindset is important for both the person experiencing the medicine and the person who's sitting with them.
I have heard of MAPS before, and I've heard of Rick before because I've seen him on a couple of appearances of the Joe Rogan podcast, and that's kind of what sort of sparked my interest in learning more about this. So let's just talk about ketamine a little bit. Now, in a regular, let's call it regular, that's not the right word, but in a regular medical context, what is ketamine used for in general? So if you go into the hospital and you end up on ketamine, what are the general parameters for that?
Ketamine is an anesthetic, and it was actually developed in the 60s. I can't remember what year exactly. And it was developed as an anesthetic. And one of the unique characteristics of ketamine is it keeps the airways open, as opposed to other anesthetics where that's not the case. So it was actually the anesthetic of choice in the Vietnam War because it was very safe to use on the battlefield. And at high doses, it functions as an anesthetic. But what's really interesting is at lower doses, it functions. Sorry, let me step back. It's a dissociative anesthetic. So essentially what happens is you dissociate from your body. You're not experiencing pain. At lower doses, it can be used as a pseudo psychedelic, and that's how we're using it in psychotherapy. But it has a long history of very safe medical use. And in fact, it's on the WHO's list. WHO is the World Health Organization of essential medicines.
And who would have been the early practitioners in using ketamine, aside from its obvious normal function as an anesthetic? Who was there a pioneer that started the journey toward using it as a form of psychotherapy?
Yes, I would say John Crystal is one of the early pioneers. But then there are people who have sort of taken it further, and someone I know, personally fairly well is Raquel Bennett, who has been working with ketamine for mental health indications for about 20 years. So this was before it really caught on. It's only really caught on in conjunction with psychotherapy in about the past 5 years or so.
And in a therapy setting, obviously you're using much lower doses than you would, as an anesthetic. So talk me through, if you can, and I'm sure it's different for everybody, but when a patient, client, whichever word you're going to use, is given ketamine in a therapy setting, what effect does that have on their brain, and what does it do for them?
Great question. So when we're looking at using ketamine for mental health indications, we can sort of go one of two ways. One is very low dose, which we call psycholytic, and ketamine sort of functions as a lubricant to allow painful things to come up and be processed. Or in the psychedelic realm, which is still lower than anesthetic, where some people become completely nonverbal in the psychedelic realm. One of the things that ketamine does, and actually this is true for all of the psychedelics, but it's been studied quite a bit with ketamine, is it turns off something called the default mode network in the brain. So the default mode, it's called that because when we are just doing our sort of on autopilot, just going about our day and doing our things, those are the neurons that are lit up in the brain. And the other thing that's very interesting is when you see people, the brain scans of somebody who's very depressed, the same areas of the default mode are lit up. So there's a correlation between sort of living in that default mode and also experiencing depression. Psychedelics, ketamine included, they sort of turn down the volume on the default mode. And it allows you, well, one analogy is if you can imagine, um, let's say you're a skier and there's fresh snow and you're going down the hill, you can choose to go anywhere you want to go because there are no paths ahead of you. And that's sort of like what your brain looks like as a baby. As we get older, there are many paths, there are many sort of ruts in the brain, and we get stuck in a rut and we go down that same rut over and over. Ketamine is sort of like fresh snow coming down and clearing the pathway and allowing us more flexibility. So one of the key things that we are aiming for with ketamine psychotherapy is an increase in cognitive and emotional flexibility to get out of that rigid thinking, which is associated with depression.
So I'll give you an example just from what I know about myself. I am someone who often thinks the worst. I invent problems where I have conversations with myself that I'm imagining having with other people that haven't happened. They always end up badly. Is that kind of what you're talking about by the default setting, the rut that we get in just as soon as something happens, like, oh, this is bad, this is not going to end well. I guess that's kind of what anxiety is in a way. So is that what you're talking about in terms of default paths and ruts?
That is certainly a very good example. We would call that catastrophizing. And it's like jumping into the rut of everything is going to hell in a handbasket. And it's going to get worse and worse and worse. So yeah, that's absolutely one of the things. And we also talk about rumination. So ruminative thinking, when you bring up a thought and you just churning on it over and over and over and you can't let it go. And I think that's a little bit of what you're describing.
Mm-hmm. Yes, absolutely.
Yeah. So ketamine will turn down the volume on that, and it allows us to, and there's also this enhanced neuroplasticity. So with ketamine, it's about 36 hours or so after you've taken ketamine that you have this enhanced neuroplasticity, meaning your brain can actually form new connections. And so it gives you that short-term relief of, okay, I don't have to catastrophize today, but it also gives you the chance to make a different choice.
That was going to actually be my next question. Is it something that, like when some people get on antidepressants and anti-anxiety, they're on them forever? And is this something similar where you have to continue to take it to have those effects? Or like you said, with the rewiring of our brains, is that something that'll fill in those ruts eventually, hopefully, so that you don't need to be forever on any kind of medication?
Well, the shorter answer is it depends. When ketamine started to be used for mental health indications, it was primarily used, as I sort of alluded to, in the emergency rooms as an IV. And you could still go to IV clinics to get ketamine. IV administration of ketamine is not as amenable to concurrent psychotherapy. What we usually see with people who are having the medical kind of approach is they'll go in, they'll do an initial series of 6 infusions, maybe 2 times a week, and then that's their loading dose, and then they go into maintenance mode, which is usually once every 4 to 6 weeks. That is one model, but I do want to be really clear that there's a lot of flexibility in the way that ketamine is offered. So in that perspective, it might be something, and for some people, they need to have that infusion on a regular basis to keep the depression at bay. What I really love, and I have to admit to my own biases, I'm a therapist, so of course I'm going to lean that direction. But I love the fact that when you're coupling ketamine with psychotherapy, that you have a chance to actually change some of those beliefs. And it's my goal to essentially work myself out of a job. I don't want people to have to do this forever.
Mhm.
Some people I work with might have 2 or 3 of these sessions and they're like, I'm good. Some people might have an initial series of 8. Typically it's between 4 to 6, but initial series of maybe 8 or so. And then they come back as needed. That might be monthly. It might be, every 4 to 5 months. It kind of depends on what's needed. But we
Mhm.
offer a lot of flexibility, and the goal is to not have a new dependency created on this molecule, but to learn new ways of being and make lifestyle changes so that you don't need to have it all the time.
You mentioned earlier that the obviously the dosage can vary, and sometimes it's of such. And you'll please tell me if I'm wrong about this, that the dose can leave someone nonverbal for a period. Is that something that is that where the is there a line where that psychedelic effect is more likely than a lower dose, or again, does it depend on the person, how they react to it, and so on?
It really depends a lot on the person. The traditional wisdom for ketamine is you use weight-based dosing. So, like a typical dose would be anywhere between zero point 0.5 to 1.5 milligrams per kilogram. Um, However, what we see is that weight-based dosing doesn't really apply that well for ketamine because I can have, well, for example, one client that I did quite a bit of work with, she's in her early 60s, very petite, very athletic, and you would think that she would have a lower dose. But she would take, the max dose that we do in the office. And then at the end of the session, she'd get up and go for a hike.
Mm.
So, and then I've had people who were much larger bodied people who preferred to work at lower doses. So part of it is, of course, the body weight piece, but a bigger part of it is how defended the person is. And
Mm.
ketamine is a medicine you can fight, unlike something like LSD, where you take it and you're on for the ride. I have seen people fight ketamine, especially if they're very defended or very highly cognitive, and they might need a higher dose.
Mm.
So it's incredibly variable. And one of the reasons that we do a series is the first session or two, we're figuring out what is the right dose for this person. And I also want to say that more is not always better. Depending on what's coming up for people, I might say to somebody who has done higher dose work, I'm wondering if you might want to do a lower dose today so that we can talk through some more of this particular issue that's coming up.
So it's not like, let's say, morphine, where if I break a finger and I need morphine for pain, let's say, I take a certain dose. But if I have my arm cut off, obviously, I'm going to need a heck of a lot more morphine. So does the dosage that you give to a patient client, does that have anything at all to do with the state that they are in mentally at the time?
Yes, it does. So, I mean, if and I do want to clarify that if somebody is using ketamine for anesthetic purposes, that is very much, I can't speak to that. I'm not an anesthesiologist, but that is very much the weight-based kind of dosing.
Mhm.
In terms of mental state, there's somebody that I'm working with right now who I think would benefit from very, very low doses of ketamine. And she's contemplating that. Her emotional state is such that she's very defended and really has a lot of traumatic material, and she's scared of what might come up. So we've talked about that. We haven't engaged in that yet, but it's something that we may do. But there's a high degree of client or patient, I use the word client, autonomy and what they're deciding is best for them. And we at our clinic, and I think most of the practitioners that I know, adopt the start low and go slow approach. Start with a low dose, slowly titrate it up. You can always offer a booster, but you can't take it back as quickly. Well, that is one advantage of IV is you can turn off the IV,
Right.
so it's more responsive.
Is there a reluctance from, and I would think there probably is, from some people that you suggest this type of therapy to? Because I think a lot of people, when they hear psychedelics, they think exactly what they think: LSD, they think mushrooms, they think bad trips. How do you go about soothing those types of fears for clients that you are recommending this therapy to?
Well, one thing we do is we don't actively solicit clients. So we're not going out and sort of pushing this. I mean, I mentioned one case where I've suggested it to someone. This is also somebody I've worked with for, I think, 8 years now.
Mm-hmm.
So there's a very long-standing relationship. But in general, it's not something that we suggest. We have people come to us. And if there's any hesitancy around taking a psychedelic, we say, don't do it. Don't do it until you feel like you're called to. And then let's do it with a lot of intention and caution.
Mm-hmm.
I would say that the bigger issue that I run into is not so much with clients, but with people I know. For example, my parents. My parents' generation, or my parents specifically, were not. They were not part of the hippie generation, I'll say. And I had written an article about my experiences with ketamine, and I had already told my mom that I was doing this work, and I was very proud of this article, and I sent it to her, and she wrote back and said, "Wait a minute, are you telling me you're doing this too?" I'm like, well, yes, yes, I am. That's part of it. So I had to work through a lot of her fears because she was very much indoctrinated into the, LSD is terrible. People take PCP and jump off the roof, So she had a lot of fear. And I think
Mm-hmm.
that there's still a lot of fear. Now I'm in the Bay Area of California. So there's a lot of acceptance here, but there's still, even here, is a lot of fear.
Mm-hmm. I think the war on drugs that we experienced. I was like 20 years old or 25 years old, but in the 90s, 80s, 90s, whenever it started, I think a lot of those attitudes toward certain substances are still prevalent. And I think I see it changing now because that generation is sort of moving on, getting older, and younger people are more open-minded to that kind of thing. Do you see that there's any hangover from that era that are still clouding opinions on psychedelics in
How could there
general?
not be?
Mhm. Yeah.
Yes, there absolutely is a lot of hangover from that era. And I'll bring up something that is still very controversial that happened a few months ago: Matthew Perry's death,
Mhm.
where ketamine was found in his system, and there were a lot of folks saying, "See, this is a deadly molecule." Well, the molecule is not deadly. If you take something at a high dose that is an anesthetic and get into a hot tub, it's not going to be good.
Mhm.
And that death was absolutely tragic. And the pain that he struggled with throughout his entire life, with addiction and with trauma, that's well chronicled in his autobiography. Um, but unfortunately, that death was politicized.
Mhm.
And that did not need to happen. But it happens in part because of some of the hangover from the war on drugs and the fear. Um, and the fear may come from some of the old stories that we heard, and oh my gosh, the commercials, this is your brain on drugs, with the egg in the frying pan.
Yeah.
They were intended to create fear, and they did. And fear leads to biases. And when you get locked into that, that's that rigidity of thinking. Then that blocks any kind of healing that can be done. And sure, these medicines can be used irresponsibly and they can cause problems. But if they are used responsibly with intention, then the potential that they have is absolutely mind-blowing.
Hmm.
So there's a real struggle right now. And in one of Rick Doblin's talks, I think it was a TED talk he gave, at the end of the talk, he said something that I thought was really quite beautiful. He said, we're standing on the precipice of, I think he said, chaos and consciousness. And that's really true. I mean, can you imagine another time? Certainly not in my lifetime have I experienced a time that was as turbulent and polarizing as we are in right now.
Hmm.
And good Lord, if there was ever a need for consciousness medicine, this is the time.
Hmm. Absolutely. So let's take a common client that is on a low dose of ketamine. Are they going to notice anything uh, about themselves that is different? They going to notice any changes in their own thinking, or is it kind of more that they're all of a sudden like thinking, "Wow, that I'm not thinking these things anymore. That's interesting." It's like, does the common client notice anything different about how they're thinking or behaving in during the process of this?
So do you mean when they're in the medicine, or you mean like as the medicine's worn off and as they're going about their life?
Let's say both. Let's say they're in it. They've just taken a dosage of it. Is there anything that they notice during that, and then going forward as well?
Sure. Even at low doses, I think that ketamine, it's pretty clear that it's having an effect. People will start to feel a little bit relaxed. So, and we use primarily lozenges, so they're melting in your mouth, and over the course of 15 to 20 minutes, people start to relax, and it's a very gentle come on of the experience, which is one of the things I like, especially for ketamine naive people or any psychedelic naive folks. Um, so the relaxation starts first, and then you start to experience a softening of rigidity. And what I mean by that is everyone has these protector parts. So, for example, myself, when I go into stress mode, I become very cognitive. So my head is my safe space,
Hmm.
and ketamine would have the effect of softening that and allowing me, for example, to drop into my body or into my emotions. Now, if I'm working with somebody who, because my specialty is really in trauma, it's just that this is one tool for working with trauma. And if I'm working with somebody who has a lot of trauma, they're often very defended. They don't want to go there because it's way too painful. And so this will soften some of those defenses and allow them to process something that has been essentially buried and tucked into the back of the closet, potentially for decades.
Hmm.
So that's at the lower dose, sort of during the medicine. And then often after the session, especially when there's a series and there's really, a comprehensive plan, people will often feel a sense of unity. So experiencing, and unit of consciousness is stronger at higher doses, but you can also experience it at lower doses, where you feel deeply, deeply connected with everything and everyone. Now, knowing in your head that, okay, sure, we're all connected, and quantum sciences tell us this, that's fine to know it in your head, but to experience it is entirely different. And I mean, we're on the I was about to say the tail end of a pandemic, but I don't know that I want to actually, poke the bear on that one. But I think that there's a much more pervasive and damaging pandemic, which is one of loneliness,
Hmm.
especially in the Western world. We
Hmm.
are very isolated. We are very deeply and profoundly lonely. And if you can experience a felt sense of connectedness, that can go a long way to soothing our aching and hurting hearts.
Hmm. So I've also I listen to a lot of podcasts, and I've heard people speak about ayahuasca, and it kind of intrigued me as well. But I will fully admit to my audience and to you that I'm a bit of a chicken. Like, and that's one thing that is, among other things, that has kept me from ever doing anything really strong, like cocaine, or like I'm just too afraid. I don't want to die, which is a good thing, a good way to be. But in this podcast, they were talking about how with ayahuasca, you have to be in the right mindset going into it, or it can cause problems. It can cause, like, it can take you places in your brain that you don't want to go, and that it might actually make things worse. Um, is there any type of element with ketamine that is similar, where you give people instructions, maybe a printed sheet before they start, with certain things that they should do, shouldn't do? And is there any, and again, I guess it depends on the dosage. Is there any such risk of going to a bad place with ketamine like there is with ayahuasca?
Great question. So there's two kinds of risk when we're talking about psychedelics. One is physiological, and the other is psychological. Physiologically, ketamine is super, super safe. I'll start with this one because this is the easy one to answer. But and one of the things that's great about ketamine is you can be on an SSRI, an antidepressant, and still take ketamine. The other psychedelics, the classical psychedelics like ayahuasca, LSD, psilocybin mushrooms, mescaline, DMT, which is a component of ayahuasca, these are all serotonergic. And if you are on an SSRI, an antidepressant that boosts your serotonin, and then you add the serotonergic compound as well, you can get a flush of something called serotonin syndrome, which is dangerous. So that is something to be really aware of. And there was a report, I can't remember when, but quite a few years ago, of somebody who did pass away at an ayahuasca ceremony. And what they discovered was that person had lied, that they were taking medications. They wanted to participate, so they did not acknowledge that they'd been taking these medications. Mm-hmm. So that's something to be aware of. The second part of the question is the psychological safety. And the short answer is you can experience a challenging, dark place with any of these medicines, ketamine included. It used to be referred to as having a bad trip. We don't tend to use that language anymore. We talk about a challenging experience. And I find that with ketamine in particular, because that's the molecule I have the most experience with, people will often, in their early journeys, have a very pleasant, sort of blissful experience. And it's almost like a warm handshake into this. But then later on, they can begin to encounter some of the darker, more difficult material. I've been there myself. It's scary. I did not like it. But the most growth I had was after the most difficult experience that I had. So we do a lot of preparation. We do a lot of discussing with people who are interested. It's not just about bliss and unitive consciousness. There are difficult experiences, and that's part of the point of this.
Mm-hmm. I was going to say, because if it's something that caused you trauma in your life, you've probably, like you said earlier, buried it down, packed it away, taped it up, don't want to hear from it anymore. And now all of a sudden, what you have taken such great lengths to shove away, there it is all of a sudden, and now you have to deal with it. So I can understand how that would be quite a jarring thing for someone that has dealt with this trauma, but also, like you said, necessary, because how can you learn to live with it if you don't confront it?
Correct. I sometimes use the analogy of, if you walk into a room that has a lot of furniture in it, but the room is dark, you're like, okay, I don't want to look. I don't want to look. I'm going to keep the lights off. You're going to trip over the chair that's in the middle of the room. Mm-hmm. Because just because you're not looking at it doesn't mean it's not there. So why not turn on the lights and be able to navigate around the chair? Mm-hmm. That's an analogy that I use when talking about mindfulness, but it is equally valid for psychedelics. You are turning on the light, you are looking at things that you have chosen not to look at, But just because you didn't want to look at it doesn't mean they're going to go away. They're not. They
Yeah.
won't go away until you look at it and do the work.
Yeah. You're not getting rid of the chair. You're just acknowledging that it's there and learning how to navigate around it,
Yes.
basically. Yeah.
Yeah.
So you mentioned DMT earlier. Correct me if I'm wrong. Is that the substance? There's a substance that we produce naturally in our brain. Is that DMT or is that something else?
It is DMT. It is produced in the pineal gland at birth and at death in very small quantities. So it is endogenous, meaning our bodies do produce it. Now, ayahuasca is a combination of DMT from one plant and a monoamine oxidase inhibitor from another plant. So if you take DMT alone, it's a very brief experience, like 15 minutes.
Hmm.
But if you take it combined with this inhibitor, then it lasts for many hours. And that's the ayahuasca ceremony that we have all heard about.
Hmm. Interesting. What is the purpose of the natural DMT that we produce?
That is a question for the ages. I don't know the answer.
Okay. Well, that'll
I
be
mean,
something
I
I
could
can Google.
speculate, but
Yeah.
I don't know.
Yeah. Okay. Well, that's okay. That'll give me something to research later. So, how has um, the use of ketamine? We'll stick with that since that is your area of expertise. Um, what advancements have you seen in your time working with it? And because as we know, medical science is evolving all the time. And where do you see it going? Not in terms of just ketamine, but what do you see on the horizon for psychedelic therapy in general?
We're still at, I think, a very fragile time. And while those of us in the field are like, yay, it's here, it's happening, we have to be careful with that excitement because it is fragile. And the whole thing could go up in a puff of smoke if we're not careful.
No pun
Um,
intended.
right, no pun intended. um, with ketamine, what I'm seeing a lot right now, I don't know if it's advancement so much as it is explorations, but I'm all for the exploration. That's how we learn. And people are experimenting with, okay, so what if I couple ketamine with EMDR or with internal family systems work or with brain spotting? So different kinds of psychotherapy modalities. I don't know yet if that is better than trusting the inner healing intelligence, which is sort of it comes from the indigenous wisdom, but it's also the older tradition of psychedelics, and it's one that I follow, which is that we hold that all of us are by nature whole, and we just need to remove the blockages to access that wholeness. And the medicine helps us to connect with our own inner healer. So it's not the therapist, it's not the medicine, it's not something externally doing the work. You're doing it yourself. And I hold very closely to that.
Mhm.
I will say that there is one aspect of it that I've been exploring and have found it to be helpful and really enjoyable, which is including very high quality essential oils along with the ketamine work. And I've been studying with a couple in not Santa Fe. They're in Taos or outside of Taos, New Mexico. Florian Berkmeyer and Kathy. Oh gosh, I'm blanking on her last name right now. I'm so embarrassed. I'm so embarrassed. But they have websites on this. Kathy's website is called Kathy's Attars, ATTARS.com.
Mhm.
And the other website is Aromagnosis, gnosis spelled GNOSIS.com. I've been studying with them and their work with essential oils. And what's interesting about ketamine is that it turns down all of your senses except for the sense of smell. It
Mm.
actually enhances the sense of smell. So when you're coupling ketamine with very high quality oils, I'm not talking about oils that you get on Amazon, for example.
Mhm.
You can actually bring out certain qualities. So there's certain oils that help you to cry tears that you haven't allowed yourself to cry, or to connect to a feeling of nurturing.
Mhm.
And I will frequently use those in ketamine sessions, or I will offer them as one way to deepen the experience. So there's a lot of that kind of thing happening right now, but there's not one particular protocol. And I kind of like that because it gives all of us different ways of working. And I would say that working with one practitioner with one particular medicine is going to be very different than working with a different practitioner with that same medicine, because we all bring our own aspects into it.
I guess because it's so new, that, as you said, there's not a book written, on the subject that, okay, we have to follow. It would seem that there's almost more room for exploration and discovery, because it is such a new style of therapy.
Yes. There actually is a book I should have mentioned, especially when you asked about sort of the early thought leaders on this. Phil Wolfson, who's in Marin in California, wrote a book called The Ketamine Papers. And that is sort of standard reading. If you're working with ketamine, you really need to have read that book. And there's much more that's coming online right now, but they're all different ways of working.
Now, we all know that governments can be the enemy of innovation and forward thinking and forward progress. If anyone's listening, I didn't mean that. Don't cancel me. But how is it regulated in the United States? Is it a federal jurisdiction? Is it a state? And what kind of struggles are proponents of this type of therapy? Because you're dealing with the government, there's no doubt you're coming up with struggles. What kind of struggles are people experiencing in trying to get this to become more mainstream?
Excellent question. And this is a huge area right now. So with ketamine, we were lucky because it's used as an anesthetic. It's already legal by prescription. It's a Schedule III drug in the United States. Now, we're using it off-label for psychotherapy. And actually, for any mental health indication for ketamine, it's being used off-label. But the more it's used, the more data there is out there, the more support we have for the efficacy of this work. We're not likely to see a clinical trial for ketamine because it's generic, it's off-label, and clinical trials, to get a drug to market, is approaching about $1 billion. Now, if the drug is generic, it's not going to happen. So that's not going to happen for ketamine, which is unfortunate. But what we're seeing right now is a lot of changes in legislation with the other medications. So I've mentioned MDMA and the MAPS program. The clinical trials of MDMA for PTSD indications were phenomenal. It was named a breakthrough therapy. There was approximately 70%, what's the word? Not reduction, but 70% of the people who went through the therapy who had PTSD after the therapy, which is 3 sessions of MDMA, they no longer met criteria for PTSD. There is nothing out there with that kind of number. The FDA is expected to announce their decision in August. We're expecting that it will clear. However, having it be legal does not necessarily mean accessible. It's expected that if it does clear, a round of therapy is going to cost about $40,000. Yeah. This is, it's not expected that insurance is going to cover this. So this is the next enormous battle that has to happen, because the people who need the medicine the most certainly don't have $40,000 to pay for it. If you're severely traumatized, how functional are you going to be at work? How you're not going to be able to make that kind of money. The other thing that we're seeing right now, and I'm still very hopeful that it clears, but we can't delude ourselves into thinking that that's the last hurdle, because it's not. We're seeing struggles happening in Oregon right now. So Oregon legalized psilocybin and has now started to offer it. Their wait list, last I heard, it's over a year long, the wait list for it. And the regulations they're there for a reason, but they're also reducing the accessibility. There's an attorney who is licensed in both Colorado and California. His name is Sean McAllister, and he's been deeply involved in these conversations. I was actually talking with him, I think 2 weeks ago, about what's happening in Colorado, because Colorado has also legalized medicine. What's different about Colorado is they've taken two pathways. They have the legalization pathway, which is very tightly regulated, and then they have the decriminalization pathway, which is not as tightly regulated. Now in California, there's a bill out there right now for legalization, but it does not include a decriminalization pathway. That means that if and when these medicines become legal in California, there are going to be a lot of restrictions that are again going to reduce accessibility. So that is a huge issue that no one has the answer to.
And what I am worried about, like with any medical type of breakthrough, and I'm sure you are too, is that often when we do see these new medications or therapies or whatever come along, it instantly becomes a cash cow for the big pharmaceutical companies. And like you said, it becomes inaccessible to the people that need it most, because most people making $400,000 or $500,000 a year probably are not going to be making use of it. Is that something that concerns you as well? If it becomes more mainstream, more legalized, more accepted, that we're just going to run into a completely different problem with affordability and accessibility?
Oh, 100%. 200%. We're in a stage, and I need to clarify, I'm not an anti-capitalist, but we are in a stage of late stage capitalism where the ability to grow revenue upward has been limited. And so the only way to grow revenue is to push downward on resources. And that means pushing, and the word that makes my blood run cold about psychedelics is when I hear the word scaling. It's, reasonable profit is fine. The idea of scaling is how fast can we push this out there? How can we maximize profit? How can we get this into as many people as possible? And I'm like, whoa, 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 slow your roll, step on the brakes. We don't want to scale these medicines. We want to be very careful with them. We want to move slowly. We don't want to try and become a pill mill for ketamine or any of these medicines. So yeah, it absolutely worries me. And this is really the shadow side of psychedelics. So in psychology, we talk a lot about shadow, which is what we don't want to look at. And this is what we don't want to look at with psychedelics, but we have to. If we don't look at it, we are going to run into a lot of trouble.
Because if you look at what is happening with the opioid crisis, which is an absolute catastrophe, both in the United States and even here in Canada, it's bad as well. And there seems to be no appetite to do anything about it. But if you look at what, you broke your arm, you need something for the pain, here you go. And then the next thing you know, we've got tens, hundreds of thousands of people hooked on it, lives destroyed. And do you see any possibility with something like psychedelics that could eventually be an issue as well, over prescription?
We're seeing it already. Psychedelics are not addictive in the way that opioids are, for example. However, they can be psychologically addictive. And there's a case of John Lilly that's fairly famous. He was a pretty severe ketamine addict. Now, it was psychologically addictive for him. And he was self-injecting very, very high quantities. So that is certainly a risk. But what we're seeing right now, and I'm not going to name any particular companies, but there are companies, and there's more than one, that are doing telehealth only with ketamine with very little oversight. And while the goal of increasing accessibility is a laudable one, and one that I completely support, I do not support it in the absence of oversight. Now, when I say oversight, I'm not talking about regulations. I'm talking about make sure that the person has a relationship with the provider. It's not somebody, like I had somebody call me up once and said, I just read this book by Michael Pollan. And I'm like, oh Lord. I love the book. That's not a knock on Michael Pollan. I think he's an incredible author. But when someone calls and that's the first thing they say, I'm like, this is not somebody looking for healing. This is somebody who's looking for a good time. And so we really have to do digging. If somebody wants to take one of these medicines and see God, and that's all they're in it for, then my response is, let's slow down and let's really investigate why you want to do this, because that's not a good reason.
Mm-hmm.
And with the telehealth companies, without that oversight and a deep relationship with the providers, there is a greater potential for misuse.
Mm-hmm. You mentioned MDMA earlier, just for the benefit of myself and the audience. Could you talk a little bit about what that exactly is and how it differs from ketamine, for example?
Yes, MDMA. Well, it's interesting. You have the
Is that
classic.
Molly? Is that what they
Yep,
call Molly? Okay.
yep,
Yeah.
yep. It's what they call Molly. It used to be ecstasy when it was combined with speed for raves. So in the world of psychedelic medicines, MDMA is not really a psychedelic, but ketamine really isn't either. It's sort of psychedelic adjacent.
Mm-hmm.
Um, but MDMA is very different. So ketamine is similar to sort of a dream state, and then the classical psychedelics have a lot of visuals. With MDMA, it's really neither of those. It's considered an entheogen, so it's a heart opener. And MDMA is one, I think it is the only medicine that is exclusively man-made. Everything else, including ketamine, has been found in nature. Now, of course, there are analogs that have been created after the fact by drug companies largely. MDMA, though, is a little bit different. What it essentially does is it calms down the fear center in the brain. There's this little structure in the brain, there's actually two, one on either side, called the amygdala. And the amygdala drives our fight-flight responses. It drives our fear responses. And for example, somebody who has severe PTSD, one of the sessions that I witnessed when I was in the training was a woman who was pregnant and witnessed her husband be killed in a very graphic way. And she was unable to move past it, and also very worried about the baby. So in that case, she couldn't even look at the grief and the trauma of that moment until we calmed down, or not we, I wasn't there, until the practitioners calmed down that fear response. And then she could allow herself to grieve and cry those tears, but crying tears of a clean pain, meaning it's cleaning out the old wound, as opposed to crying tears of futility.
Mm. So would one of those, one of MDMA versus ketamine, would they be used? Like you said, MDMA is more to shut down that fear response. Is that something that's going to be more used in a more acute situation? Like something maybe happened to someone a week ago and it's still incredibly fresh, or a month ago, whereas ketamine, it might be something that they've been dealing with since childhood and they've pushed aside. Is there any difference in, maybe this substance is better than this one, in any of those type of regards?
Yes, there is a difference, but it's not super clean cut like that. And in fact, I've had a lot of people say, well, ketamine's for depression, not PTSD. I'm like, oh, no, I beg to differ. I think it's very effective with PTSD. But depending on the person, certain medicines might be better. So there's someone I'm working with right now, not with any medicines. And she has a lot of history of trauma, also tremendous, tremendous grief. And I would certainly be willing to work with her with ketamine, but if I had the choice of any medicine, she would be an MDMA person because of the particulars of her situation.
Mm-hmm.
So I think it's very specific to the person and the context, not so much if it's short-term or acute, it's this medicine. If it's this topic, it's this medicine. It'd be great if we had that kind of primer that had everything listed out, but it's much more complex and nuanced than that.
Now, for someone, we'll get back around, as I was mentioning about myself earlier, I would consider myself to have some anxious tendencies, like I said, where, I think, so I haven't heard from someone in a while, something's wrong, they're mad at me, they hate me, that, just that usual kind of anxiety. Is something like ketamine, is it overkill for someone that is at that level that has anxious tendencies, but fully functional, no deep trauma, that kind of thing? Is that still something that could work for someone in that situation that just wants to maybe quiet those voices?
Absolutely. And that really gets back to the rumination. And people who have that pervasive, persistent anxiety, even if it's not acute, it's there all the time. It's like in your backpack, you're wearing it all the time. That's exhausting. That's
Hmm.
really exhausting. So no, it's not overkill. And by the way, a ketamine session is only 3 hours, as opposed to some of the other psychedelics that are 6, 8 hours. Um, so it's not this huge dramatic thing. It's not like, oh, you have to have tried everything, have done all the things, and you're still experiencing this profound suffering to want to do this. I think it's very helpful for anxiety. Now, the other one that has been shown to work really well for anxiety is LSD microdosing.
Mm.
I don't know a whole lot about that, but the founder of the grad school I went to, one of the co-founders is Jim Fadiman, and he was a big proponent of LSD microdosing.
Hmm. Interesting. Um, One thing I wanted to ask you is, and this is sort of an aside, but it still relates. One of the things that I've kind of been noticing and been contemplating lately is young people, teenagers especially. Um, they're growing up in a world that I did not know when I was a teenager. There was no social media, there was none of that. I was never comparing myself to, some personal trainer on Instagram that's driving a Lamborghini, for example. So these kids are growing up comparing themselves every day. And we all know what the rates of mental health issues among young people are. Is the therapy that you're describing, is that something that you are seeing being provided to young people, obviously with the client or with the parents' consent and so on? And if so, if we are seeing young people undergoing this kind of therapy, does it differ in any way from a fully grown, fully brain developed adult?
Yes, it does differ. Yes, it is happening, and it is hotly debated about whether or not it should happen. So the brain doesn't really fully form until your early 20s. And so there's a lot of questions like, well, if we're giving this medicine to a teen whose brain has not fully formed, what is that going to look like? And we don't know the answer to that.
Mhm.
So it's a bit of a black box. The counter argument to that is, okay, that's fair. We don't know what is happening, but we do know that when we have this teen who's severely depressed, their brain is going to form in part in response to that severe depression.
Mhm.
So if we can alleviate the depression, does that give them a better chance?
Mm.
And no one knows the answer, but this is one of the things that is hotly debated among ketamine providers.
Mm.
We at our clinic have not yet worked with teens. We have thought about it, but we haven't gotten there yet. The family absolutely has to be not only a part of the consent, but a part of the entire process. This is not, when you're working with a teen, you're working with the entire system of the family.
Mm.
There are a couple of providers who do a lot of work in adolescence, and Jelaine Andrews at the Ketamine Training Center is one person who has quite a bit of experience with that.
Do you believe that there is a trend, and I've noticed it again on social media? I know that's not the basis for everything that is true, but I find a lot of romanticizing of mental illnesses. I'll see videos like, oh, my anxiety kicked in again, and this is and it almost seems like we've tried so hard to make mental illness not a stigma and say that yes, you can talk about it. Now it almost seems like there's a romanticizing about it, and that if I'm a teenager and I see all my friends are, oh, I've got anxiety, then all of a sudden I'm going to have it too. Do you find that, do you agree that that is an issue, or is that just something I'm sort of seeing on my own?
No, I think that there's some validity to that. And if you think about just the way that the world goes, there's a pendulum effect. So the pendulum's over on one side and it swings all the way over to the other extreme. And for most of my life, and certainly before I was born, there's been such a very strong stigma against discussing any kind of mental health issues.
Hmm.
So of course the pendulum had to swing to the other extreme of, and I see it a lot on TikTok, just people crying and emoting. And while I'm happy that they are being vulnerable in a way, I do think that maybe the pendulum has gone a little far in that direction. I'm not sure if romanticization, I'm not saying that correctly. I'm not sure if that's exactly the word that I would use, but certainly people have gone pretty hard in that direction. And I think it's already starting to shift back maybe a little bit.
I hope
I
so.
think that we should talk about it. I don't think we should be scared to talk about mental health. I don't think we should be scared to talk about suicidal thinking. It's very common. But I also don't think that we should be actively trying to trigger each other.
And that's something else that I saw on another podcast about mental health. It was about young people's mental health, is that um, parents that are genuinely concerned about their children, of course, are sending their kids off to therapy when there might not really be a need for it, because they're dealing with normal teenager stuff, but the parents, because of the time we're in, they're extra worried about their kids. Do you see that at all? Maybe not just in your practice, but in general, that there seems to be a rush to maybe get young people into therapy, onto certain medications that they might not really need at this point?
I don't think I've seen any change in terms of parents pushing to get their kids into therapy. I haven't seen a big change for that. And I actually think that, especially in a post-COVID world where these kids were out of school for a couple of years at a very formative developmental period,
Hmm.
I think that all of them could use a little bit of support, whether that's individual therapy or peer support groups, something. So I don't see that being an inappropriate push. What I do see, though, and this is not new, and this can come from parents, it can also come from teachers, that the child is placed into therapy to make the parent or teacher's
Hmm.
life easier, not to help the child.
Hmm.
That's not new. It's alive and kicking still.
All right, before we wrap this up, this has been a very fascinating conversation. I could go on about it for another couple of hours, and maybe down the road we can reconnect, because I'm sure there's going to be advancements. But if there's anything that you would like to share where my audience can find you online, if there's a website, social media, anything like that that you'd like to share, feel free.
Wonderful. Well, the best way to find us is on the website. It is bayareamentalhealth.com. We are located in California, in the Bay Area. We do provide services throughout California. We are also on social media. So Facebook, you can look at Bay Area Mental Health, as well as Instagram.
And does the website have any interesting articles, research that can be read by my audience and by myself, because I'm interested in digging more into this too?
It absolutely does. So there is a web page about ketamine-assisted psychotherapy. I also have a blog that I write, and I include some information about ketamine there. Oh, the other place to look for me, you can look for me personally on LinkedIn, either under my name or under Bay Area Mental Health. And I have a monthly newsletter that I put out on LinkedIn, which is more substantial than the blog.
That's awesome. Well, I will put those in the episode description so that everyone can check it out. And thank you for your time, Linnea. It's been very interesting, and I'm looking forward to doing some more research on my own.
Well, thank you so much, Scott. I appreciate the time and the opportunity to talk about something that I think is really important right now.
I agree. Thank you.